I've actually been quite impressed with the Grotmas Advent detachments that Games Workshop has released so far. They have a lot of interesting and creative ideas that are both thematic and decent enough that you can still make some fun, fluffy lists centered around the ideas that are presented. With the way that detachments are set up in 10th edition, it makes a really good framework to fit a whole host of ideas into. You don't need to create loads of different enhancements or stratagems. You have the same amount of things to work with to fit within a singular vision. And the Grotmas detachments are showing how you can make some really unique things with that framework. I don't really care about the balance or comparing these detachments to the current meta unless they seem completely overtop broken. If these new detachments were just straight up better than the index or codex ones, then that's kind of pointless. You're just moving the power from one place to another. Games Workshop has done some interesting stuff here. The latest Custodes detachment allows dreadnoughts to become characters, which is a really awesome idea that gives a new aspect of vehicle lists. The Tyranid one is super Tyranid warrior heavy, and that's fun for all those players who have a ton of Tyranid warriors and wants to give them a whirl. The Advent one has a cool mechanic that actually has downsides if used in a certain way for a huge buff. And even in the indexes and codexes. Codices? Who cares? There are some really cool mechanics that are being explored. Some interesting attachments with strats and enhancements that really focus on a particular playstyle, like the Orc Dreadmob, which just makes everything hazardous in some way, which is really cool. Or GC cults that have a lot of unique mechanics not really seen elsewhere. I think. They're really complicated. I don't really understand any of it, but they seem pretty good. Don't look at me like that. However, I do feel as though there is a lot of underutilized potential within these attachments, and that's not really a fault of the detachments, and more of a fault of how there seems to be fewer mechanics that Games Workshop wants to be able to manipulate. 10th edition is a lot more defined and concise, but that does mean you're losing out on some of the wackier things. You're really only affecting stats or maybe some movement shenanigans, or adding some keywords here and there, but there's nothing that is really pushing the boat out, and those restrictions feel like missed opportunities. And that's where I come in. As your resident YouTube insane person, I'm here to present a detachment that encompasses more of the kind of things that I'd like to see and how you can get some really interesting designs to give new life into your armies. And to do that, I'll be creating my very own fully handmade Thousand Suns detachment. No AI here. I couldn't even remember that Custodes exists. I mean, neither did I, but I'm using a Thousand Suns detachment because 1, I play this army, so I know at least a little bit about it. 2, Thousand Suns and Zechian shenanigans are a good theming for wacky and absurd ideas. And 3, the Grotmas one was kind of okay, it wasn't terrible, and I think a lot of the issues are that the Index Thousand Suns are extremely strong, and losing out on a lot of that will always feel worse. Like with all the Grotmas stuff, these ideas are at least very interesting. The flow of magic mechanic is pretty cool, and the buffs you can get are really nice for psychic attacks. But without a way of making standard weapons psychic like in the Codex, this becomes a lot of character spam, which is what the Codex already does due to the Cabal points. Also, it has anti-Magnus synergy, which is nice if you don't want to bring Magnus, but Magnus is completely broken, and possibly the best individual unit in the entire game, so maybe if you want to see less Magnus on table, you should fix Magnus. And no, increasing his points won't help. You've had to increase his points over and over, and he's still taken. He is inherently broken and needs fixing. Magnus was 440 points already, so Mortarion was 410. Magnus is 465 now. Mortarion is 300, and Magnus is still better than Mortarion. How can you change the points from a difference of just 30 to a difference of 165 without thinking that maybe the data chiefs have some issues, GW? Just think for a sec. To be fair, I do think this attachment is interesting if you want to play lower points games, like 1,000 points, where bringing Magnus would be kind of a dick move. But regardless, I think Thousand Suns are a good background to explore some more interesting mechanics. And no, this isn't just another just play Age of Sigmar twist like Combat Patrol, although that game does have some really fun mechanics. Nor is it going to be as far as Age of Sigmar First Edition, which had Now, this attachment I will be presenting is completely and utterly not in any way, shape, or form balanced. And it's not meant to be. You wouldn't make an attachment with all of these mechanics in one, but they are here as conversation starters, as things that could be used to make detachments more interesting, give new life into units by changing them in more distinct ways, and other weird mechanics that we haven't really seen in 40k 10th edition. I want to spark discussion in the comments and get your ideas for cool stuff, or any thoughts on the ideas that I presented, but don't worry about the actual balance or numbers here. Just take the mechanic itself and think about that. If you want to see some ideas of mine that are actually thought out beyond an extremely basic idea, and have at least had some attempt at balancing them, then you can sign up to the higher tier of Patreon or YouTube memberships, get access to and help give feedback on my Screaming Ravens supplement, which I started working on in a previous video. This will be a 4 detachment Space Marine supplement with my Screaming Ravens chapter, which will include lore, homebrew units, crusade rules, and more. I'll be making videos about the supplement in the future, but if you want previews on what I'm working on to help steer this ship that's captained by a psychotic bold VTuber funny man, and help support this channel as I move to this being my only income, links to my Patreon and memberships are in the description, and you can join all of these fine folk. If you can't support financially, or you just don't want to, then like, comment, subscribe, all that good YouTube stuff helps out a ton as well. Okay, with all that shilling out the way, let's dive into my Thousand Suns Detachment. And again, to reiterate, this is not balanced and will likely push boundaries beyond reasonable game design and may be far more complicated and unreasonable than the game can handle. Maybe having one of these ideas amongst more standard choices would be interesting and something to actually consider. The wording will also not be robust, so don't even think about reading these as rules as written. To really push this home, this detachment is called Completely Absurd Design Idea Attempts for Exploring Limitless Lunacy. These are just ideas to spark discussion. So discuss! Most detachment rules when they deal with a specific unit are mostly just giving buffs for that particular unit or unit type. This is fine, but it doesn't really have as much variety as there could be. A few maybe add things like battle line, which means you can take more of them, but it's only really the new Custodes one that gives a fundamental change to how you could use a unit. So my first detachment rule idea, Untethered Automatons. When rubrics or Scarab Occult Terminators are not led by a character, their sorcerer becomes just a regular rubric or Scarab Occult Terminator, and they generate 0 Cabal points. However, they gain a big buff. I didn't really think about what that big buff would be, but it'd be a nice buff to make up for the fact that they aren't magic anymore. And yes, this is just giving a certain unit a buff like they do in other detachments, but it's utilizing a way that drastically affects how the unit is actually composed and how the army could be played by not having as many Cabal points coming from your units. The replacement buff would have to be pretty strong, or you can design a detachment around characters being more likely to be on their own, or a detachment that has other ways of using Cabal points. Units affected could be given a new keyword, which is something GW has done, and that keyword could be used to give a whole different playstyle through the enhancements and stratagems. But there's a whole host of things you can do to manipulate and affect things like this. One of the more interesting mechanics out there are Drukhari Venoms and Votan Sagittars, which allow you to split units during declare formation. So a detachment rule that allows splitting units for certain buffs or change the number of models a unit can have is another thing that can be changed. Maybe untethered automaton units must be in groups of 10. Why? I don't know. This other detachment idea is based around utilizing the army rule in a different way. This is an idea that can be expanded to a lot of armies with these really unique army rules like Leagues of Votan, who have a cool detachment which gives a little extra objective to your grudge tokens, but doesn't necessarily change how the grudge tokens actually work. So for 1000 Suns, how about Sorcerous Bulwark? Units that generate Cabal points have a 5-up Feel No Pain. Whenever these units take damage, you lose Cabal points equal to the damage instead. If you have 0 Cabal points, you lose the 5-up Feel No Pain and any invuln saves. This means you can still use your Cabal points to cast stuff, but at the risk of becoming weakened, or you can just hoard them and be unstoppable. I guess, like current 1000 Suns. But this mechanic would completely change the way a player thinks and interacts with their army rule. Is that in a good way? Probably not, but you could probably think about these kind of things and these kind of mechanics that really put a twist on existing rules. Looking at the enhancements now, I wanted to explore some interesting design ideas we've not really seen so far. Shifting Machinations. During your command phase, this character can be removed from a unit and placed into a new unit, leading that unit instead. But it's fairly self-explanatory, and I'm surprised it hasn't been done. There's these kind of mechanics around leading and not leading units and actually moving your characters between units that I'd like to see explored. Warp Crash. Once per battle, this character can sacrifice themselves. Every unit within 12 inches moves 2d6 closer to where the character died. If a unit is moved to within 1 inch of the center of that explosion, it takes a number of mortal wounds. The number of the mortal wounds doesn't really matter, that's the balance thing, but this enhancement explores a couple of things. A mechanic which deletes a unit from your army for a big gain, and 2, moving your enemy. And as I've written this, I put every unit, which I think actually is more interesting because it also moves your own units. Age of Sigmar has the Gargant Suplex, which is a really fun mechanic that allows you to basically throw an enemy model to a different position in melee. In my single game of Mesburg, Steve had used his Balrog, which has a lash that can pull models towards it. 40k doesn't really do that kind of mechanic, which is a shame because it's a really cool mechanic to explore. Now, for Age of Sigmar, the Gargant Suplex only works on monsters or war machines, so individual models, making it a bit easier. Similarly, in Mesburg, each model is treated as an individual, so trying to make an entire enemy unit move is quite complicated to actually play. Additionally, you're relying on your opponent moving their models where you want them, because you don't really want to encourage picking up other people's models. There's a lot of collaboration needed to avoid arguments and getting your greasy gamer fingers on someone else's stuff. But I like the idea of having something that gives a big shift in movements once per game for a fairly hefty price. Imagine getting this character in a position that pulls several of your opponent's units off an objective or away from melee. Or maybe you take the risk and at the same time pull some of your units forward. Time Echo. At the start of each command phase, place a marker under this character's position. Once per battle, this character can rewind time with its attached unit back to this position, undoing the previous turn. Is this a pain to keep track of? Yes. What happens if that space is occupied? No idea. Maybe the unit can't rewind, or maybe the accompanying unit gets telefragged or something. Is this just a more complicated version of the Genestealer Cult's army rule mixed with Echo from League of Legends Ultimate? Watcher in the Warp. After both players have deployed, your opponent must redeploy 3 units. These units then have some sort of debuff. I was thinking of something like the character with this enhancement knows where they've moved, so you can always shoot at them, or maybe these units can't move or are slowed the first round, something like that. I mean, we've seen a fair amount of redeploy rules, so this just flips it on its head. There's something interesting to think about in terms of having rules that gives your opponent a buff that will be repaid with interest later. Kind of like how the Hedon Knights of Slaanesh work from Age of Sigmar, except not shit. For the stratagems, these are kind of ideas which are in some sort of category, and I'd imagine a detachment kind of one of these as their really unique thing. I do believe that a detachment shouldn't just be all new mechanics or all crazy stuff, because it'd be far too overwhelming. Working around a single theme or idea which is highlighted by a big grandiose display of power from one stratagem makes things feel super cinematic and cohesive. Gift of Tzeentch. In the enemy command phase, select one enemy unit. They gain +1 to hit, +1 to wound, stealth, and a 5 of invuln. In your next command phase, roll a d6 for each model in the unit, adding 1 if the unit is infantry. On a 5+, that model dies and is replaced with a Zangor under your control. The idea of a detachment that is all about giving the enemy power now for some catastrophic consequences later is something I'd really love to see explored at some point. We've seen stratagems that do have a downside for increased power, like this one from the new Admech detachment, or this one from the new Chaos Knight detachment, but not anything that makes your enemy stronger. I think you would want to make this one a bit more sane. For example, the 5 roll to see if you die only happens if you actually do anything to the buff. So you can't just throw it on something that wouldn't be able to shoot you. You could also make it once per game, or just make it really expensive, or have it so you have to use the stratagem for one of your units to draw a line of sight to your enemy. Mutate Landscape. Steal this psychic power from 9th edition and make a piece of terrain get spicy. I mean, it's right there. Utilize the terrain as something that can be affected. Mutate Landscape was the name of the secondary objective, being 9th, which affected objective markers, and 10th still has some of those, things like Deadly Prize from the Vanguard Spearhead. But I'm sure you can do some other interesting things with objectives in this terrain in 10th, especially terrain. With everything just being ruins most of the time, having a chance to do something else with those pieces would be really cool. For example, being able to teleport between 2 pieces of scenery, having those sceneries become like a portal between them. If you want to get really crazy, moving the scenery or destroying the scenery. That's probably too far for 40k. It works in Age of Sigmar because of the fewer shooting elements, but it might still be cool. Grasping More. Choose a mutilative vortex piece from your army, and that mutilative vortex piece can choose an enemy unit within X inches and move it towards them. Just more movement shenanigans out of phase. That's what I really want, please. There's not much else to say here. I just like the idea of Chauncey being able to throw these gribbly face tentacles out and grab people and eat them. Vengeful Reciprocation. The enemy unit phase, after a unit in your army has lost at least one model from their unit, you can immediately shoot back, adding 1 to... Okay, I've written damage here for each model lost in the unit, but that's probably not the right thing, especially if you have, say, a 10-man flame brick squad that just lost 5 units and then they have a damage 6 flamer. There's some sort of buff that increases. I guess this is what the below starting strength and below half strength qualifiers are used for. Yeah, I probably should have thought of that before writing this one out. Maybe something like if your unit was taken to below starting, they get rerolls to hit, and if they were taken below half, they get rerolls to wound or something. That's already a thing that exists. No, this one was terrible. How about this crazy idea? Pick any unit. Their entire stat line is now all D6s. Yeah, maybe infantry only, because you could accidentally turn a knight into a 1 wound, 1 toughness model, but I like the idea of just suddenly being like, okay, this entire stat line could be anything now. For either you or your opponent, which means you could either risk it on yourself to try and get something more tough, like 6 wound Zangors, or you give it to your enemy to try and give them 1 toughness, but you might accidentally give them 2 up save, 6 wounds, 6 toughness. Orcs might want to look into this one. Arcane Mimicry. Used when an enemy uses a strat. For the rest of the game, you can use that stratagem instead of this one. Instead of trying to make your opponent have to spend more CP for the big powerful strats, just take it instead. This is just one idea of a way to counter enemy stratagems in a different way. I'm sure there are other ideas, like a strat that just lets you nope an enemy stratagem or change the target. Battlefield Shift. Once we're battling your command phase, flip deployment zones. Yes, this one is completely ridiculous, but imagine the chaos in a game where you basically just flip which side of the board counts as yours. Did your enemy just charge your deployment zone but hasn't got capture any outputs yet? Swap deployment zones and they made no progress. Did you just get that card but you barely made progress? Well, your deployment's here now. This kind of stratagem is expanding the sphere of influence to what a strat can actually affect. Stuff like deployment zones, objective marker positions, where no man's land is. Those kind of interesting things. I am certain that there are significant issues that need to be resolved to make any of these viable, or that there are some fundamental problems with some of the mechanics I've mentioned. But let me know what your ideas are and what kind of stuff you think would be cool to explore more in 40k. I love discussing this kind of stuff, and videos like this help me get these messy, deranged ideas out of my head and into the world for other people to deal with. So thank you for indulging me if you watched this far, and I hope that this demented brain dump hasn't caused you too much mental anguish. If you believe you have been negatively affected by the content of this video, please be sure to get in touch with the Porter's Ballot Stuff helpline by clicking subscribe, and we'll get back to you within 7 to 10 business years.